I don't think we fully finished off, though, actually dealing with the issues caused by the central banks and the government.
Yeah, okay.
What is the solution? I know it's a big, obvious question, but like, if you were advising on policy, what do these people need to be doing?
Well, the solution is Bitcoin, but obviously that's not. If you just say that on Capitol Hill, they're going to just kind of roll their eyes and kick you out of the meeting.
Have you mentioned it on Capitol Hill?
The way we approach it in a more sort of like you bring them along kind of way, right? So how do you bring them along? First, you highlight the problem of low interest rates and how it's contributed to inflation, right? So that's step number one, is to kind of explain to people that the Fed has not gotten it right, that the Fed has kept interest rates too low for too long. In other environments, the Federal Reserve increases interest rates too high. It's like the Fed is flying blind and not making decisions. It's not this kind of the impression that you might have of the Fed as this group of super geniuses who have it all figured out. It's not true. So I think just puncturing that veil is step number one in getting people to think about a different system. So once you puncture that veil, then the question is, what is a better system than what the Fed is doing? How do we think more rigorously about interest rates as it's related to the whole financial system? Then you start to explain to people. You want to look at housing prices. You want to look at energy prices, some of these other things. So we published a paper recently on housing policy that's also up on our website. I think that's the most recent one, where we walked through actually a simple chart that we put at the top of the paper. It compares median household income after taxes to the median home price in the United States and just charts that over, I think, a 75-year period, something like that. And there's this massive collapse. There it is. He found it. So look at that. You see like that thick blue line, right? So it's looking at the last 40 years, from 1985 to 2022. And you can see that, for a good chunk of time there from like 1990 to 2010 or so, it was about, 32%, meaning the median household income after taxes was about a third of the median home price. And then it just collapsed in 2012 or so. Why is that? It's because interest rates, as they were shut to zero after the financial crisis, basically led to a massive speculative bubble in the price of homes. And as a result, your average median income did not keep up with that. So the amount of money that you earned as a percentage of the median home price declined, not because your income declined, but because home prices skyrocketed so much, the denominator skyrocketed.
Hold on, but it went up from 2005 to 2010. Is that big jump around 2008, the financial crisis?
Yeah, so it's basically, you had a growth in income throughout that period that sort of kept pace with or even increased relative to median home prices.
Yeah.
And then there was kind of a speculative bubble going into the financial crisis driven by a bunch of factors. And then
that's here, right?
That's right. That's right there. That's the financial crisis right there. So the ratio goes up for a bit because people's incomes were going up alongside housing prices. And then there was a collapse. So the collapse, of course, that shaded area is when the recession was during the financial crisis, that gray or that pink bar on your screen. But basically what you're seeing is after a couple of years, home prices started to really skyrocket as a result of the Fed's intervention in the economy. And that meant that even if your income was staying roughly the same, it was harder and harder for you to afford a place to live.
Was it anything to do with the...
So a lower number is bad on this chart from your standpoint as an earner, a wage earner, and a higher number is good.
Is any of that to do with the likes of BlackRock's or these big funds going out and buying up these houses?
Absolutely. So it's all related. So why is BlackRock able to buy up all those homes?
Because they have a disproportionate access to cheap credit.
Right, because they can borrow money at 0% interest rate. So this is one of the dogmas of the Fed that's completely wrong. So one of the theories that's widely believed at the Fed is that when you lower interest rates, it creates a wealth effect. Because when you lower interest rates, it increases access to credit for lower income people. They can borrow more and thereby do more things and lift up their station. That's why, in general, it's progressives, people on the left, who favored loose monetary policy because they believe that, well, if you reduce the cost of borrowing money, who needs to borrow money? Poor people. And this will help poor people by allowing them to borrow money. That's not how it works in reality. In reality, the way it works is poor people have low credit scores and don't have any net worth. And so banks don't lend them anything because they're like, you're never going to pay me back, or at least there's a higher risk that you're not going to pay me back. Whereas if I lend money to BlackRock, I know they're good for it. So
how much do you want? Take
exactly,
as much as you want.
Exactly. We'll lend you as much as you want.
Yeah.
And so BlackRock can borrow $100 billion and flood the market, flood the housing market with that, and buy up all these homes that are getting constructed. And then that's part of how what the Fed does is it artificially juices the demand for housing by subsidizing it through low interest rates, through easy credit. But the people who actually need to afford the homes, those people making $62,000, $63,000 a year, they're out of the market. They can't buy anything. And so what you've done is you've massively increased wealth inequality. You've massively increased the cost of living because those higher home prices filtered down to the high cost of rent, even if you aren't owning your own home. Yes, for the third of the population that owns its own home in the U.S., that's fine. Or, that they'll do better because their home value will increase. So their property taxes may go up as well, which is another problem with all this. If you're retired and your home value goes up and your property taxes go up, you can't afford those property taxes, right? Because you're not making more money to pay that property tax bill. So that's something that creates, when you talk about gentrification, gentrification is driven by the fact that you have high property taxes in cities, that if you're retired and you own your home, if you worked hard your whole life, you finally own your home, but you're retired, so you're not making more money, and your property tax bill keeps going up, you're forced to sell in order to live somewhere that's lower cost.
I've heard that's a big argument or a criticism what's happened here in Austin.
Yeah, I mean, so in Texas, property taxes are pretty high in general because we don't have an income tax, we don't have a capital gains tax, and property taxes are determined at the local level, and so that does happen. So as the real estate values in Austin have surged in large part because of the Fed. If you've owned your home for a long time, yes, you might be happy that your home value has gone up, but at the same time, your property taxes have gone up as well. And that home value, you can't dine out on that, right? I mean, that home value it's a paper gain, whereas your property tax you're paying every year. So that can be a problem. And so there's a lot of every 2 years when the Texas legislature meets, the property taxes are a hot topic for that very reason. But all that to say that the cost of housing in particular, so if you actually look at what is it that people spend money on in a given month, housing is the number one line item. Housing for the average person in the U.S. is about a third of their living expenditures. That is actually, when you calculate the consumer price index, about a third of it is housing costs. Now, it's actually higher if you're low income, for the obvious reason that if you're lower income, housing is just going to be a higher proportion of your costs of living, whereas for wealthy people, it's slightly less. But still, housing is number one. And so when the Federal Reserve drives up the price of housing for the people who are either first-time home buyers or renters or retirees who pay property taxes, they all get hurt by this policy. And it's just one of these things where there's this massive gap between the Fed's point of view and reality.
Why, though? Like, if everyone else can see it, if you can see it, everybody I know can see it, why do they get it so wrong?
I'm working on a book about this topic, which is the working title of which is Why Experts Fail.
When will this be done?
Well, I'm still working on the proposal, so it's early days, early innings. But the whole idea is to walk through all these different phenomena as to why experts fail by their own standards. So it would be very easy to write a book that just says, the salt of the earth people are right and those pointy-headed nerds are wrong who work at the Fed. It's more, why is it that experts think they're awesome? Experts think they're awesome because they know more, they've studied more, they have more access to a broader range of information than you as an average person have. So, and they've seen a lot, they've studied the history of something a lot more than you have. And that's why they are experts, and that's why they know more and should be entitled to make these decisions for us. But there are a lot of problems with that theory. One of which is, and this really applies to the Fed, is that historical data does not necessarily apply to the world of the future. So 75 years ago, the U.S. economy was largely a domestic economy. When General Motors made cars, they generally sold them to Americans. When American steel manufacturers like Bessemer made steel, they sold it to Americans, to GM to build their cars. So there was a domestic market that the Fed could say, okay, if we increase the price of the dollar or increase the price of interest, we can affect this kind of contained, siloed economy. In a global economy where trade is worldwide and 24/7, that doesn't apply in the same way. And so you can do a lot of things to try to stimulate the local economy, the domestic economy, that don't necessarily work in the same way when you talk about the international context. And so that's an example of something the Fed just doesn't understand. And so the fact that financial markets are global, it's not something that the Fed understands that in theory. It's like, yeah, I know the financial markets are global, but when they look at historical data, they're not taking that into account. So that's one example of a way in which experts fail, is that experts are really good at studying the past. That's often how they become experts. But the past does not necessarily predict the future. And where experts often go wrong is by applying historical knowledge to some a contemporary or future event in which the circumstances or context is very different.
It's kind of arrogant, really.
There is certainly a component of arrogance to it. I try to step away from that kind of terminology in the sense that the purpose of this book is, or the goal of this book is, to really explain to experts themselves why they should have more humility.
But they won't read it because they're an expert.
Well, hopefully they will. I mean, my goal with this book is to have that, to tell an expert audience, in a sense, hey guys, check yourselves, realize that there might be something you're missing. You may not have complete command of the context and the information as you think you do. I mean, COVID is obviously a great example of that. That's kind of what motivated me to think of this topic for a book. And so for those of you who follow my work on COVID, you'll know what I'm talking about here. But there's a broad range of areas of life, of public policy, where expertise, not only, it used to be experts were about giving you advice and you could choose to take the advice or not. But increasingly, we've evolved into a society where experts they have the force of the government behind their opinions. And so it's especially important in those contexts that experts have more humility about the opinions they issue and the rules they impose on society. Because as we've seen with COVID, particularly in the context of school closures, those expert opinions can be incredibly damaging with a lot of long-term effects. And another example of that is fiscal policy, right? So we shut down the economy because of COVID expert opinion. Then we said, oh, well, we've got to stimulate the economy by spending all this money we don't have to compensate the businesses and the people who had their livelihoods taken away. And oh boy, now we have a massive budget deficit, and now we've had these low interest rates that we now have to compensate for, and that creates all these economic ripple effects down the road. So a lot of this, we were talking before about, is this because politicians and government officials don't want banks to fail? They don't want anything to fail, right? It's not just banks. And that sort of panic and sort of lurching around not letting things fail or not taking risk. It's real risk aversion is really the problem. Because, right, if we'd had on COVID, there was real risk. COVID is a serious problem. Lots of people died because of COVID. Lots of people got seriously ill because of COVID. It's not something that was made up. But having said that, we overreacted at a time when we had evidence to indicate that we didn't need to overreact. We could have had a much more tailored response, a much more targeted response that maximally kept the economy open and society open to the degree that we could practically. And if we had done that, we wouldn't have had to lurch into this massive fiscal stimulus, this massive monetary stimulus that we're going to be paying for generations.